Behavioural economics on a post-it, or behavioural public policy on a post-it, number 16. The Gestalt Characteristics. Now, the concept of utility, or subjective value, or utility, it's got a long and contentious and debated, to some extent, history in the discipline of economics. But there are a branch of economists that have been quite prominent over the last 15 years or so, reasonably prominent, that have been characterised as advocating what's called the new economics of happiness, almost like a neo-Benthamite approach, really, that what matters is to try to maximise the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I suppose that's what they're advocating. And certainly a lot of those people within that camp believe that we should be, or policymakers should be, aiming to try to maximise what's called experienced utility in some sense. So that is to say that when people go through an event, you should aim to try to measure the subjective value or the utility or the happiness or the well-being that they're getting as they go through that event, as they're getting from that event. And then you can sort of measure some aggregate utility that they get from the event. So if you just consider this little event in the top corner here, just put my piece of paper there to make it clear. You can imagine this is an experience. This is time on the horizontal axis and utility on the vertical axis. So you're going through this event over time, and it gives you a constant level of happiness or utility as you go through the event. Right? It's just a hypothetical scenario. So the idea is that you could measure people's what's called their instant moments of utility at periodic intervals as they go through the event, and you can measure their utility in some ways they go through. And then at the end of the event, you could add up all of those instant moments of utility to give the total or aggregated experienced utility for that event. And then that we should be aiming to produce events for people, or encourage people to partake in events that maximise the overall utility that they get from their lives, I suppose, right? Now, the Gestalt Characteristics, this is a body of work that's, again, associated with, at least in behavioural public policy, associated with Daniel Kahneman, but other colleagues have contributed greatly to this over the last 30 years. The Gestalt literature seems to have gone a bit quiet over the last few years, but it was certainly an active literature from about 1990 to, 2005, 2010, something like that. And what this literature demonstrated is that often when people go through events, and then you ask them after they've been through the events what they thought about those events, they often seem to want to trade off, or they're often willing to trade off in some way, some total utility that they might have got from that event to avoid or to be attracted to particular aspects, particular characteristics of those events. And those are what are called the Gestalt characteristics. All right? And there's a few of them. I've just pointed out 4 of them here, which I think are the 4 main ones, particularly the top 2. And I'll just whip through these to give you a sense of what the Gestalt characteristics are. So there's the end effect, and this is the peak effect, number 2. And sometimes these two together are sometimes called peak end evaluation. But let's just focus upon the end event for now. When people think back on events, the last particular moment of that event seems to stick prominently in their memories. And you can think about this in the experiences in your own lives as well. It can either be, relatively short events, I suppose, watching a film, little longer events, going on holiday, perhaps longer events, going to university years, or even perhaps your whole life, if you get to the end of it and you look back. People seem to remember the end, and things that really end badly carry a weight for people that in some ways, in some instances, at least partially outweighs everything that went before, right? So this is just a comparison of two events here, right? This is utility. This is the one we just spoke about a moment. This is time. This is the utility that this person got from this event. This event underneath it, a different event, gives the same utility for roughly the same amount of time, but then things start to get gradually worse, and then the event ends, right? Now, if you look at it, this event probably gave greater total utility than this event, because, at this point, they gave probably more or less equal amounts of utility, and then we got a bit of extra utility at the end from this event, even though things were getting gradually worse. Now, when people look back, they might remember this event as actually being worse than this event because it ended relatively badly. This one ended relatively well, even though this one gave greater total experienced utility. So an example of the end of it, one that was pointed out by Daniel Kahneman, I think, is imagine you're listening to a lovely piece of classical music on a record, if you still listen to vinyl, and you really enjoyed the experience of the record as the music as it's being played all the way through, and at the end of the record is scratched, and you get like a horrible noise at the end of the record. That horrible noise at the end of the record could ruin your whole experience as you remembered it of the piece of classical music, even though you enjoyed the vast majority of that particular piece of music. That's the end effect. I won't give examples as we go through for each of these, otherwise it will make the video too long, and I'll come back to some Gestalt effects later in different post-its. Peak evaluation. People seem to remember the spikes of an event, whether they're peaks, really good moments, or troughs, especially really bad moments of an event, right? And this causes them to display, all of this causes them to display what's called duration neglect to some degree. So they kind of forget, to some degree, often, how long an event lasts for, and focus upon these particular moments, right? So something that, an experience that they go through in life or even in a shorter episode that is really bad, right? That experience, they might have been willing to trade off some total utility of the event or total subjective value of the event in order to avoid that really bad moment as they went through the event. That's the peak effect or peak evaluation. The direction of change seems to matter to people often, and often, especially in relatively shorter episodes rather than whole life periods, people tend to prefer things that go gradually better rather than things that get gradually worse, even if the event that got gradually worse gave greater total utility. So there's one example in the literature, and I forget the author it's associated with. It might have been Dan Ariely, but looked at visits to the dentist and asked people to imagine, I think, going to the dentist 5 consecutive days. And either the pain, in this literature, people often focus upon disutility or pain rather than utility or happiness. But ask people to imagine events that get gradually better over the week. So each visit to the dentist gets gradually less painful, compared to visits from Monday to Friday that get gradually more painful. And people tended to prefer, I believe, the profile that got gradually better rather than the one that got gradually worse, even if they produce identical levels of pain or disutility over the course of the week, or even if the event that gets gradually worse, the profile that gets gradually worse, produces slightly less total disutility. So the direction of change seems to matter to people as well. And then finally for here, the velocity of change, what's called the velocity, the speed of change, matters to people. So people generally prefer things to get either gradually better or gradually worse, rather than having these sudden increases, decreases, peaks, spikes and troughs that are very volatile during an experience. They prefer things to be smoother, even if the more volatile experience produces greater total utility or less total disutility, if we're looking at pain. So there we have it. I'm going to finish at that point. Relatively long post-it. The Gestalt Behavioural Economics, and a post-it number, I always forget, number 16. The Gestalt Characteristics.